Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Good afternoon, everybody. You know, Woody Allen, the great film director, said 90% of life is just showing up. As Tom knows, as Althea knows, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're here. So thanks for coming today. I do want to talk a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg and talk about it in terms of the service the soldiers and civilians provided during that three-day battle. How many people have been to the Gettysburg National Military Park? I suspect that most of you have. So I'm not going to recount the Battle of Gettysburg, but I will remind you that it was a three-day battle fought on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Not far from here, the largest battle ever fought in North America. 160,000 soldiers were engaged, and when it was over, 10,000 were dead on the field, 30,000 terribly wounded, most with rifle fire, and 10,000 taken prisoners. Gettysburg was a turning point in the war, and this is where Abraham Lincoln came to give the most important speech in history, the Gettysburg Address, where he reminded us that we have great tasks remaining before us. And knowing some of the work that you do here in the Rotary, you have great tasks remaining before you. So we're going to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, but we're going to look at it in a little different way. We're going to take a look at it in terms of service above self, tying into some of the Rotary themes. The Battle of Gettysburg, absolute carnage here just west of Lancaster. So let's talk about some of the stories of people who were on that battlefield who provided service not only to themselves but their fellow man and their country. The first story is the story of James Perman. James Perman was from southwest Pennsylvania. James Perman was born in Pennsylvania. On the fields of Gettysburg, he will earn the Congressional Medal of Honor for helping a wounded comrade. Amid a frantic retreat as rebels fired from three sides at the wheat field of Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863, James Perman would go out into the wheat field of Gettysburg where 4,000 would fall, rescue a wounded comrade. While rescuing his wounded comrade, he was shot in both legs. He would somehow recover his wounded comrade, and his friend would live. Later, James Perman would receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for helping a wounded comrade, literally rendering his friend's life above his own. In fact, his own life was later saved by a Confederate soldier he would later meet in Washington, D.C. following the war. But he would receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. He would have one of his legs amputated. A young woman named Mary Witherow would meet James Perman in Gettysburg, would help nurse him back to health. They fell in love and were married. But he gave up his leg to help his comrade. He might have given up his life. He was one of 64 men on the fields of Gettysburg who did win the Congressional Medal of Honor, James Perman. He did survive the American Civil War. Now, as we tell you that story about helping a wounded comrade, I want you to bring that into today's world, and remembering that soldiers around the world, in particular in the Mideast and elsewhere, are still helping wounded comrades, still helping other people, rendering service over and above their own self-interest. Here's another story I want to tell you about Alonzo Cushing. Alonzo Cushing was from Wisconsin. He was a 22-year-old lieutenant responsible for a battery of cannons at the Angle at Gettysburg, the hallowed ground on that field. 22-year-old lieutenant as General George Pickett and 12,000 soldiers came across a mile of open ground on that hot summer day of July 3rd, 1863. As the Confederate Army in a battle line a mile wide moved across that field, Alonzo Cushing, responsible for a battery of cannons, told his men to keep firing, keep firing, keep firing, until he was shot on the shoulder. He lay down on the ground, bleeding to death. His friends would rise him to his feet. Once again, he would tell his men to keep firing the cannons, until he was shot in the groin. As he lay bleeding on the battlefield, he would somehow struggle to his feet until he was shot in the mouth and died. His last words were, "Keep firing." He gave up his life for his fellow man and his country. 4 years ago, Barack Obama awarded Alonzo Cushing the Congressional Medal of Honor. That medal is on display at the Visitor of Gettysburg, another who gave up their lives to help others. As I think about Alonzo Cushing helping others on the battlefield, there's an 1863 depiction of soldiers being evacuated from the battlefield, and to the right of it, soldiers being evacuated from the fields of Iraq. And yet another story, it wasn't just the soldiers who rendered service above self, the civilians also rendered service above self, including 15-year-old Matilda Pierce. Matilda Pierce, known locally as Tillie, lived with her father, James Pierce, in the town of Gettysburg. He was a butcher. When the Battle of Gettysburg began and there was fighting on the streets of Gettysburg in an early form of urban warfare, her father said, "We have got to get you out of town." She left the town of Gettysburg, went 2 miles away to the Weichert farm just south of town at the base of Little Round Top. As they were bringing the wounded and the dead off Little Round Top, this 15-year-old girl was told to help the surgeons. They said, "Your job is to stack up amputated body parts." She stacked up amputated legs as high as fences. She was covered with blood from head to toe. When she went home, her mother didn't recognize her. She later wrote a book about her experiences called What a Young Girl Saw and Heard of the Battle. A 15-year-old girl, like so many others, rendering service over and above their own self-interest. Not just the soldiers, also the civilians. And as we think about what's happening around the world today, we still see soldiers interacting with young teenagers in the battlefields of the world today. And then there was the Christian Commission. You know, before there was the Red Cross, before there were any number of organizations that would help wounded soldiers, at the time of the Civil War, organizations like this were coming together to help wounded soldiers. The soldiers were living in filthy camps. The number one killer at the time of the Civil War was diarrhea. For every soldier killed by a bullet, 2 died of illness and disease. Living in filthy camps, filthy conditions, soldiers a long way from home, drinking polluted water, had very little to eat, and were living exposed to the elements and the insects day after day, week after week, and they were dying in droves. But an organization was created to help clean up the camps and help the wounded soldiers in and around those camps. The organization was known as the Sanitary Commission. One of the leaders of that commission was Frederick Law Olmsted, who was one of the builders of Central Park in New York City, but rendering service above himself, he brought together civic-minded people to form this organization, to travel with the armies, to clean up the camps, and after the battle was over, make sure that the soldiers had medical supplies, make sure they had food, and send their wagons all over the camps following these horrific battles. As Andrew Cross would later write, who was in this Christian Commission, "No pen shall write out those histories, no heart can render into and be made fully to partake of those varied and unmingled sorrows which identify so many thousand hearts with the hills and fields, the rocky places, the swamps, the houses, barns, and around the lines of that terrible battle." The Sanitary Commission distributing medical supplies, and the Christian Commission, yet another organization distributing Bibles to soldiers, making sure that not only their physical needs were attended to, but also their spiritual needs. Civic-minded people helping soldiers at the time of the Civil War, and civic-minded people help people over and above their self-interest today in the Red Cross and many other organizations. And then we have the story of Sallie Myers. Sallie Myers was a 21-year-old school teacher at Gettysburg when the Battle of Gettysburg began. This 21-year-old school teacher could not stand the sight of blood, but after the battle was over, even after the armies left, they left behind 20,000 wounded soldiers. Every house, every home, every church, every school, all became hospitals. When surgeons probed the wounds of soldiers with dirty fingers, digging out bullets and amputating body parts that piled up on the streets of Gettysburg like cordwood, the local civilians came to help those wounded soldiers, finding tremendous courage and tremendous compassion. And even though she couldn't stand the sight of blood, day after day, week after week, she was in St. Francis Catholic Church. She was in the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and all the others helping wounded men. A wounded man named Alexander Stewart of the 149th Regiment died in her arms. When he died, she notified the family. His brother came, his brother Henry Stewart. They fell in love, and Sallie Myers would marry Henry Stewart, who would later soon die himself following his own war experience. She went on to be one of the few women in this country who were invited to the huge reunions of veterans following the Civil War, and was considered and celebrated as one of the women who acted as a nurse during the Civil War, acting beyond her own self-interest. Sallie Myers, she later wrote a book called The Ties That Bind. And then there's Rachel Smith of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In the weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, she, along with hundreds of people here in Lancaster County, tried to help the wounded soldiers in their own way. They weren't necessarily going to the battlefield, but they had to find their own way to make a contribution to the war effort. Rachel Smith from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, would go from door to door to door, collecting anything she felt that the soldiers would need. She would collect fruit, preserves, hospital supplies, and she would forward those to the battlefields of Gettysburg, and then later she herself would go to Gettysburg and perform duties helping wounded soldiers at Christ Lutheran Church, a building that still stands today, the oldest church in Gettysburg. But whether you were living in Lancaster County, whether you were living in York County, whether you were living in Berks County, or anywhere within 100 miles of Gettysburg, local citizens were doing everything they could to act beyond their own self-interest and help wounded soldiers. Nursing, which had been largely a male profession prior to the Civil War, was now in such dire need that females around the country were learning the skills they needed to have. You know, there were, for all practical purposes, there were no medical schools in this country. Maybe a medical school in Baltimore or Philadelphia that would produce a handful of surgeons, but even their techniques were medieval. So the surgeons were overwhelmed. They didn't have the skills they needed, and thank goodness the women of this country helped provide their own skill set to provide some compassion to the soldiers wounded and killed at the Battle of Gettysburg and elsewhere. Some of those women included the Daughters of Charity, a group of Catholic nuns. The only women in this country who had nursing skills at the time of the Civil War were Catholic nuns. And just south of the town of Gettysburg, about 10 miles away, is the town of Emmitsburg, Maryland, home of the first parochial school in this country, home of Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton, the first American-born Catholic saint. But at that town of Emmitsburg, Maryland, there was an order of Catholic nuns, the Daughters of Charity. After the battle was over, they were the first people to come to Gettysburg. They put 10 nuns in a wagon, and their priest, Father Orlando, came to Gettysburg, and those nuns fanned out into all the buildings and churches and provided their skill set to help the civilian population attend to the physical needs of desperately wounded soldiers torn to pieces with rifle fire. 58 caliber mini balls, bullets as big as your thumb, fired at a low speed. When the bullet would hit you, it would pulverize your bone. Metal fragments rip up into your body, causing massive infections. There were no antibiotics, but there were Catholic nuns there to help the wounded. Today they're referred to as the Angels of Mercy, acting beyond their own self-interest, helping others, Catholic nuns. And yet we see in the ruins of Syria today, we still see nuns in those ruins helping soldiers and civilians who have been affected by the war. And then there's Attorney David Wills. Attorney David Wills. He was in his 30s. He's a young man. He was a prosperous attorney in the town of Gettysburg, had once worked at the local bank. Born in Adams County, Pennsylvania, David Wills was a Republican. He was also an agent of the governor, the Republican governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, who was, of course, aligned with Lincoln's political party. David Wills, who was a local attorney, as the agent of the governor, tried to help the wounded people at Gettysburg. He acted as a one-man FEMA organization, coordinating the military and civilian response to the horrific nature of the Battle of Gettysburg. Because the hospitals were literally for miles around. The fields were covered with dead horses, nearly 5,000 dead horses whose carcasses were being burned. The governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin came to those battlefields, saw the horrible conditions, and bought 17 acres of land on Cemetery Hill to give the Union soldiers the burial he felt they earned. He asked David Wills to coordinate the effort, and David Wills would purchase that land on behalf of the state of Pennsylvania, coordinating the civilian and military response. And then 4 months after the battle, with winter coming, David Wills wanted to have a ceremony dedicating the cemetery to those soldiers. He invited the most famous public speaker in the United States to come to Gettysburg. His name was Edward Everett from Massachusetts. He had been the Secretary of State and the President of Harvard University. Edward Everett came to Gettysburg by train, and on November 18, 1863, spent the night at the home of attorney David Wills. Mrs. Wills, Catherine Wills, held a dinner party for Edward Everett and for the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. 30 people spent the night in his house. The next day, there was a procession to the cemetery, and Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours. And then before a crowd of 15,000 people that November day, a day very much like the one right outside that window, Abraham Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. This is a depiction of the soldiers being reburied at Gettysburg. African-American burial parties would go out into local communities where the soldiers had been buried on the field, and they were all buried on the field. You know, Tom and I would go out there, dig a trench, dump the bodies in. Later, the bodies were removed at the direction of attorney David Wills and reburied in the cemetery. And of course, we're still burying soldiers today. Attorney David Wills, who was the host of the President of the United States, who would speak at Gettysburg on November 19, 1863. And bringing it home is Thaddeus Stevens, a resident here of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who would also take a courageous stand and act beyond his own self-interest. He once had a law practice in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. By the time of the Civil War, he had moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was elected to Congress, and by 1863 was the most powerful man in Congress, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. They controlled the money. But Thaddeus Stevens was also considered kind of a radical. He would suffer as a result of the war when the Confederate Army, led by Jubal Early, came through Gettysburg. They burned his businesses. They burned the ironworks at Caledonia, just west of Gettysburg. So he would take an economic hit, but despite that, he would still advocate to free the slaves, give them the right to vote, and give them citizenship. And as the war was concluding, he was the author of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which was a courageous stand in a day of segregation. And he would die in 1868, buried here in Lancaster, referred to as the Great Commoner, a man who would advocate to free the slaves and remembering Lincoln's words that all men are created equal. And today we remember the importance of diversity and inclusion around this country. We can look back to Thaddeus Stevens as an early advocate to remember that working together we are more effective than working individually. And then the Battle of Gettysburg concludes on July 3rd, 1863, with dead bodies all over the field, 10,000 soldiers. It starts to rain, washing away the blood. Lee leaves Gettysburg with a wagon train extending 17 miles filled with wounded soldiers. He will escape from Gettysburg. The war continues for 2 more years. But on that last day of the Battle of Gettysburg, one more soldier who will do their duty is General Winfield Scott Hancock of Norristown, Pennsylvania, commanding the 2nd Corps of the Confederate Army, literally all over the battlefield, directing soldiers into position where they need to be to plug gaps in the lines. As Pickett is charging across the field, he'll be ordered to leave the field, and he will selflessly say, "I'm not going to leave the field. A Corps commander's life does not matter when our country's fate is in the balance." Winfield Scott Hancock was hit by a bullet into his saddle, a saddle nail ripped up into his groin. He would survive the Battle of Gettysburg, but would suffer from his war injuries throughout the rest of his life, but would live long enough to run for president in 1880, losing to President Garfield. And today, we're continuing to help wounded soldiers, not only in Gettysburg, but in field hospitals around the world. And as I conclude, I want to conclude with the words of Abraham Lincoln as we reflect on some of these selfless deeds by soldiers and civilians, by politicians and others, reflecting on their selfless deeds. We remember the words of Abraham Lincoln, who said 77 years ago, "Our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." And then on that November day, Abraham Lincoln, with a voice like a trumpet, would say, "This nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom and government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." Service above self. Thank you. Now, we do have some time for some questions. Yes, sir.
I was just recently up at Gettysburg, Fairfield, and my wife reminded me of about 15 years ago we worked there, and you could go into Gettysburg, get a guide, drive your car,
Yes.
explain what you were looking at.
Yeah.
Does that still exist?
Yes, I'm one of those guides. I'm a licensed battlefield guide at the Gettysburg National Park, which is the oldest professional guide force in the United States. We started in 1915. We predate the National Park Service, so you can still hire a guide.
Where do you find them?
All right, you can find them one of two ways. You can go to the visitor center at the National Park. There are always guides waiting on a first come, first served basis, or you can use the website to make a reservation in advance, make an appointment for a guide to be available to go in your vehicle to see that battlefield. There's about 150 guides. And by the way, to become a guide in Gettysburg, how many people have heard about the process? It's compared to getting into Harvard University. There's an all-day written exam and an all-day oral exam. The last time they gave the test, 150 experts from around the world took the test. 7 people passed. Next question.
Thank you for coming. I assume that Confederate soldiers also probably tried to drag their wounded comrades off the field.
Yes.
I also make the assumption that none of them were eligible for the Congressional Medal of Honor. Could
Uh,
you comment on that?
Yes, the question was, were the Confederates eligible to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor? And the answer is no. They had formed their own country, the Confederate States of America, so there was no similar decoration. After the war, there was a decoration created to honor soldiers who had done selfless service called the Southern Cross of Honor. But that was after the war was over, to honor those soldiers from the South, after the country had come back together and started to heal its wounds. What other questions do you have?
Along those lines, I was wondering, I've often wondered, there was the 17-mile retreat.
Yes.
What happened to the rebels who were wounded on the battlefield in the near term, and the massive graves that are out there now? Are there markers for any of the rebels?
So the question is, what happened to the Confederate or rebel casualties? When the soldiers were killed, they were buried on the field. The Northern soldiers, their bodies were exhumed in the fall of 1863 and the winter of 1863 and 1864. They're now buried on Cemetery Hill. That's the cemetery where Lincoln spoke, the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Confederate soldiers, their bodies were exhumed in 1872 when the women of the South demanded that their sons be brought home. So they were placed in pine boxes, what remained of the soldiers, and they were buried in graves in the South. Most are buried in a mass grave at the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Others are buried in Richmond, Raleigh, Savannah, and Charleston. So there are very few Confederate soldiers actually buried in Gettysburg. And what happens if you were captured, if you weren't killed on the field but captured? I think that was part of your question. In the near term, they would put a gun to your head, march you off the battlefield, and hold you in a prison camp in a place like Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. And then If you survived your prison experience, you were released at the conclusion of the war. If you were a Northern soldier captured by the Confederates, they would march you to Richmond, Virginia. As the war progressed, you were moved further south to Salisbury, North Carolina, and then later further south to the notorious camp at Andersonville, Georgia, where many would starve to death.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today. I have more of a comment than a question. Many years ago, my husband and I bought the CD for the
Yes.
store, and we go over every year, usually in January because it's pretty neat. And we do the tour, and it's very moving. And the new cyclorama, both of us, he's a big guy and usually not much emotion, but we're both moved to tears every time
Yes.
during that. So I try to tell everyone, if you haven't been there, do it. And you've been very fascinating today.
Well, thank you.
Go there often.
By the way, speaking of the CD tours, you know, we realized some time ago that a lot of cars no longer have CD players. You know, if you rent a car, you will soon find out they don't have CD players, so those CDs won't do you any good. So an associate of mine, Nick Wiley, and I created a tour that's now on sale at the Visitor Center, which is a GPS-oriented tour. So you download an app to your phone, and as you travel the battlefield, the GPS coordinates will pick up where you are on the battlefield, and my voice will explain the battle to you. So those are available over at the Visitor Center. A little shameless self-promotion here. Absolutely. What other questions do you have? What other questions do you have? Listen, thank you very, very much for coming.